All right. The Unit 4 exam is graded and posted. Overall, I saw a lot of really solid student work. Um, I was really impressed overall. Um, there are far fewer students who are, completely blanking the exam. And yeah, it looks like there weren't a lot of questions that were clearly flawed. There were questions that were more difficult, but no questions that one would have to throw out entirely. So that's encouraging. As far as timing goes, you don't have a long time for the corrections. They're due in just a couple of days. I apologize for that. This is kind of a tight shave. Getting ready for the end of the semester. Unit 6 starts right after spring break, and now we have the return to school. Maybe you can imagine, I'm sure a lot of you are stressing out with your time frame. I'm likewise a little overwhelmed at my house. All right, so to calculate your grade, you would take your multiple choice, add the free response, and add the free response doubled. So you would take 15 on the multiple choice plus 2 times 8 is 16. So 15 plus 16 equals a 31 would be your total. And then you would divide that by the curve. And interestingly, I had to use two different curves, one for period 1 and one for period 2 on this exam. I really can't get into it, but I had to use two different curves this time. Now, remember to ignore the multiple choice and the free response columns. Those letter grades are irrelevant. They are irrelevant entirely. Just focus on your curved score in the total column. Everyone has misleading letter grades in the multiple choice and free response columns. Those are not real grades. I was a little bit sad to see, as kids start to get more stressed out, they're more likely to cheat. I sympathize. I know that you're all under a lot of pressure, but I can't let that slide. Please do not cheat. A lot of it is kind of obvious, but hard to prove. So frankly, I'm sure you know that some kids get away with it, but whenever I can document it clearly or prove it, I do have to pursue that. There's a couple of kids who failed this exam because they shared information. It was sort of honest, but when I could prove that they had shared information, they both failed this exam. And I could see that some students were using outside sources of information for the question about genetically modified crops, and that whether that question is right or wrong, it does not get credit. You are not allowed to use outside information during the exam. Now, those are small numbers of people. Let's not focus on them. Some thoughts on the multiple choice. There's this format of question which always hurts students. It's all of the following except. There were two of those questions. All of the following are ways to feed growing populations except, and the rise in world hunger is caused by all the following except. And those two questions had the lowest results on this exam. Interestingly, they were not as low as other questions in other exams. I don't think that these were flawed questions. If 80% of students get the question wrong, that's my fault. The question was bad. On this exam, half of the students or better still got that question right, but the biggest weaknesses were those all the following except questions. That's a bummer. The College Board does use that question style, and so I got to keep it in there, and you got to look out. Always choose the one that is most right or most wrong if you're trying to find the one excluded. Um, I was a little surprised that students didn't recognize high yield varieties as part of the Green Revolution. Through selective breeding, we developed crops that give us more food per acre. That was just selective breeding, you know, like making rice that is smaller stems so you can pack more into the same rice paddy, or making corn that is shorter so it produces the stalks, it produces the seeds faster or whatever. Um, Also, I was surprised that students didn't know flooding is a remedy for salinization. Maybe that word was the problem, how to remedy something. I remember remediation is to fix something, a remedy. Um, and I was bummed to see, but not surprised, I guess, that back crossing confused a lot of students. If you have a agriculturally developed crop through selective breeding, you may have chosen tomatoes that are sweeter or redder or tougher, but you usually give up other traits like the resistance to a disease that isn't common. So when that disease comes to be a problem, you can back cross your tomato with an ancestral variety to make the new crop stronger, to bring back some of the missing genes. Imagine if you have too many stupid chihuahuas and people determine that that's a problem. Like, oh man, these chihuahuas are just too stupid. If you backbreed them with coyotes or with wolves, your offspring might be a bit more intelligent, or they might be a bit more agile, or they might be able to breathe now, or they might not have those hip problems. Back crossing or backbreeding is to return ancestral traits that have been lost through selective breeding. And again, more than half the class got this right, but these were the questions that were the hardest. In the free response, it basically went from good outcomes to decent outcomes to not so decent outcomes for a couple of reasons. Graphing seemed pretty mellow. Almost everybody got this right. There were a couple of hang-ups with how students sent it, but otherwise the graphing seemed mellow, and interpreting the graph also seemed pretty mellow, figuring out where arable land would run out for humanity. In the genetically modified organisms question, most students had ideas of why they are better, and I could see most of those questions were referencing our lecture. But then at the end of that lecture, when I listed why they are worse, it seems like a lot of kids didn't watch that lecture to the end. I know I babble, but you do need to watch the entire lecture. There were far fewer students who could explain problems with genetically modified crops. And here's where we had some cheating. I think some kids went on the internet and searched for problems with GMOs, and they used information that is kind of debatable or not well explained. And so I try not to use it in my course. And when students bring in content which is clearly external to our course, it's obvious that they got it from somewhere else, and I have to notice that. In D, there was a really unfortunate formatting issue that I have to remind you about. We've been through this many times as a class, or at least I always tell myself on the screen. Be careful what the action word says. So to explain an alternative to clear cutting is not to say the word of an alternative to clear cutting. You have to find at least a little bit of an explanation. So an alternative to coffee is tea. That's not an explanation. You could say tea is an alternative to coffee because it's still hot and includes caffeine, but it's not as bitter. And that's actually an explanation because it shows some kind of a comparison between the two. Or a viable alternative to clear cutting is strip cutting because the soil is retained by the standing trees. Students were able to give me a lot of good answers, but the biggest hangup was not the lack of knowledge, but the lack of specificity in the answer. Students who knew the word but didn't show the depth of knowledge by answering the question entirely in the format that is requested. And I was so proud of my fire lecture. I had like a bunch of good slides and I had all these local examples and like relevant stuff to our lives. And probably the biggest weakness on the free response was that kids couldn't explain how fire policy affected current fire conditions, how previous forest policy affected fire conditions. I guess it makes sense, you know, by the end of the FRQ, kids are just scrambled. So partially you're not to blame, because I understand it's tough to take a test, you know, in the morning when you just woke up. That's like this rigorous and this lengthy. But anyway, maybe I'm just kidding around. I don't know. I was a little surprised that the last part of the FRQ didn't do better. That said, plenty of students got it right. The question was sort of obvious. It was pretty straightforward and a lot of kids nailed it. Overall, good exam. Overall, I'm frustrated to see kids getting desperate. I want to remind everyone that all the content on all the exams is always in our class. Don't use stuff from outside class, and you know, just stay with the class. Take good notes, watch the videos. It's all in there. As a matter of fact, these are some of the stuff where I actually said, like, this is often on the exam, or this is likely to be on the exam, or a lot of kids on the exam don't know this one. And the corrections are due Friday before you take the Unit 5 exam. Okay,